So Wolf Hall, it's back. Unfortunately, my voice isn't. So if I start sounding very raspy or if I'm spacing out a bit, that's because my voice is just very inconsistent right now. I have been struggling with my voice coming back and forth all through autumn. It's not been fun, but I'm going to do the best I can. Luckily, because it's all voiceover, I can hide all the coughing. Sometimes I've gone onto YouTube videos and they've had interesting subjects to talk about, but it's unbearable listening to the audio because they've clearly not edited their audio down to make it somewhat presentable. They've just gone with their first attempt and then they put it out. Sorry, that's just something I wanted to rant about. So let me talk about Wolf Hall instead. So the first novel for Wolf Hall, that was in 2009, and then the sequel book, Bring Up the Bodies, I think people must confuse it all the time. That came out 3 years later in 2012. So the first two books of the Wolf Hall trilogy were adapted into the 2015 miniseries. And to be honest, I didn't really pay attention to the books or anything like that until I started working on this YouTube channel. But then The Mirror and the Light came out in 2020, which was 912 pages long. I've got the entire trilogy in paperback now, and even shrunk down to a paperback, it is still a hefty tome, that is. So if you think Hilary Mantel had 8 years to write The Mirror and the Light, and it's just like, what the hell is George R.R. Martin's excuse? Hilary Mantel may no longer be with us, but at least she managed to finish her legacy before she passed away, which I don't think George R.R. Martin is going to do. He's busy wasting his time trying to get cancelled shows on Amazon Prime back on the air. Stop trying to make My Lady Jane Season 2 happen. It's not going to happen. Yeah, so The Mirror and the Light came out in 2020, and I think immediately there was speculation as to whether it was going to be adapted into another mini-series, or like a series 2 or something. It seems as though Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light is not exactly another continuation, it's more like a sequel series. So much how like there was in the Philippa Gregory verse, there was the White Queen, and then the White Princess, and then the Spanish Princess. They're of the same continuity, but they're separate entities. And yes, Wolf Hall was a stage play, and then they adapted The Mirror and the Light into another stage play, but I haven't seen either of those. I've got 5 hours and 52 minutes left on the last book, so hopefully I'll finish that before the end of this series when it's done airing. Yeah, the marketing for this was a bit strange because ages ago they said they were filming it, and then we heard nothing, and then we got a few pictures, and then we heard nothing. And then suddenly they were announcing, it's coming out on November 10th, and here are a few more pictures. But there was no trailer. And then they finally released a trailer the next day, and it was really, really short. But luckily, I think this series has enough star power. It's not like it's trying to get another season, so it can do what it wants, I suppose. Usually, or recently, when I've seen things come out on the BBC, they've done this thing with iPlayer, where iPlayer used to be like a catch-up website where they would put out a programme on their website after it aired, like an hour after it aired, and you could watch it for a week, you could watch it for a month, you could watch it for a year. It really drew out how long they could feature these things. But then as streaming became more popular, it basically turned into a free streaming service, which was very useful. Then they decided that whenever a new series releases, they show the entire series on iPlayer, but they still air it on the BBC, like BBC 1 or 2 weekly. And I thought they were going to do this with Wolf Hall. I'm going to have to try and distinguish between the original miniseries and the sequel, so I'm just going to call season 2 The Mirror and the Light to avoid confusion. I thought The Mirror and the Light was going to be not exactly shoved onto iPlayer, but put on iPlayer in its totality on November 10th when the first episode was supposed to air. So my plan was I was going to binge watch all of The Mirror and the Light, and then I was going to do an unscripted video talking about each episode and what happened. And instead, they've decided now to be goody two-shoes and not let the Brits have an upper hand in watching something that's been anticipated for quite a while. So they're releasing it weekly on the BBC, but like from the start of the day in which it's supposed to broadcast, it'll already be on iPlayer. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, which, okay, that's fine, but for me it's a bit of an inconvenience because I was hoping that I could just cover this series in one fell swoop and then, we leave it until we get back to whatever the hell I was doing, because I am not going to be at my workstation over the Christmas period. I'm working away from home in another city, not London this time. It's down south, but a little bit more remote. So I won't be able to take all my stuff with me, and I'm going to be so damn tired I'm not going to want to do any editing. So I'm going to do this video about the first episode and what's different this time, what can we expect going forward, and then when I have finished that job, because I'll be back in early January, barring any other things coming up, then either I can do a video about the rest of the series and how it held up according to my predictions, or by then hopefully I might have reached 8,000 subscribers and then I can just do the 8K special where I talk about the books, possibly the stage plays, even though I haven't seen them, and the TV series and both of them. It's quite good timing actually. So if you want to make sure that I get to 8,000 subscribers by January, please subscribe. So YouTube did a cull on my channel recently where I think they just cut out some dead channels and then it's like made it go down a bit. So please put me back up there by subscribing and hitting that bell. So the first episode, which is called Wreckage, which is in reference to one of the chapters of the first part of the third book. The thing about the Wolf Hall trilogy is it doesn't have a typical structure. It's separated into parts and then each part has like 3 or 4 chapters. And they are so long. One of the last chapters, In the Mirror and the Light, according to the audiobook, it's nearly 4 hours long. So I'm really glad I'm listening to this on audiobook because I would not have been able to handle just reading it from the page. So the episode opens with a sort of flashback or a montage. It's a flashtage because on one side you have Anne Boleyn arriving at the tower and her execution again. And they've reused the footage of Claire Foy from that episode. But every time they cut to Cromwell, and it's always distinct that Cromwell is separate in a frame from Anne Boleyn, it's Mark Rylance again, but refilmed. So they refilmed the entire scene, but with Mark Rylance as he looks now. And I think the reason for this was because during the execution scene of Anne Boleyn in the original Wolf Hall, Gregory, his son, was standing next to him. And Gregory was played by Tom Holland a year before Captain America Civil War came out, though he was relatively unknown at the time. But now, 9 years later, Tom Holland is too expensive, so they've had to recast him. They've done the same frames again. Cromwell still grabs his son's arm, and that's how I found out that was Gregory, because I've done a whole video analysing every aspect of that scene. And then during this whole retread of Anne Boleyn's execution, we have a montage of Henry VIII, still played by Damian Lewis, but they've added parts to him, including a belly. He's bulkier, he's not huge, but there's a little hint of a belly underneath, and he's been greyed up a bit. And then he is on his way to marry Jane Seymour, so it implies that on the same day that Anne was executed, he went to go and marry Jane Seymour. Not what happened, he married her like 10 days after that. And then, unlike traditional weddings, Jane is the one waiting at the altar and he's the one that comes down the aisle. And afterwards, Cromwell, I'm just going to refer to him as Cromwell because there are so many damn Thomases. So afterwards, Cromwell approaches the gates of what I suppose is the Tower of London or his house, Austin Friars. And waiting for him at the gateway is Rafe Sadler, played by, what's his name, Thomas Brodie Sangster, who has not aged a day since 2015, or even 2004. I mean, he's got taller and his voice broke, but that's about it. This guy is literally immortal. I think he's a vampire. And Rafe asks, is it done then? And then Cromwell's like, it's done. Even though there really should have been cannons fired, but I'm just going to digress on that. And Rafe says, it's so sad that this had to happen. And Cromwell basically says, it was them or me. And then he is alone in his study, and it is revealed that he's having a imaginary conversation with none other than Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. I don't think this was in the book. I mean, Jonathan Pryce did make a very good Cardinal Wolsey, so I'm not against it. And one of the motivations of Cromwell behind bringing down the Boleyns was revenge, in a way, for the humiliation they put upon Cardinal Wolsey. Because even though Cromwell is a Protestant and he is quite adamant about destroying Catholic artefacts and dissolving the monasteries, Cromwell still saw Wolsey as like a father figure, basically, because Cromwell's own father was an arsehole. So I'm definitely sure that this is a imaginary conversation that he's having in his head, like how he imagined he would be talking to Wolsey about it. Because not long into this conversation, that's it, Thomas Wriothesley, or Risley, or as they nickname him in the series, Call Me. He comes in and he never says, who are you talking to, etc. So I think that's definitely, this whole conversation is happening in his head. He's not actually speaking, he's just sitting alone, twiddling his rings and thinking about what would the cardinal say. So this happens 3 times. I knew it was going to be a rule of 3. You don't get Jonathan Pryce for just one damn scene, do you? Later on they have another imaginary conversation where Cromwell is writing down Henry's interactions so he can predict Henry's behaviour. It's kind of like at the beginning of The Death of Stalin, where Nikita Khrushchev has his wife write down all the jokes he made and which ones were received well by Stalin, which ones weren't, so he can keep track of Stalin's whims and not get purged. So it's kind of like that. He's doing a Nikita Khrushchev. That's something that actually happened. The final scene is another conversation. They were reflecting on their first encounter where Thomas Cromwell was called a butcher's dog by both Gardiner and Thomas Boleyn, but mostly they focus on Gardiner, because Gardiner's going to be a massive antagonist. I mean, when is he not a massive antagonist? Now, Gardiner is not here yet. He'll probably show up in the next episode. Yes, but Wolsey says that dogs are loyal, and Cromwell, whose favour is on the rise, says, throw your dog a bone, and they laugh about it, and then the episode ends. So the main conflict of this episode was surrounding the reconciliation of Henry VIII with his first daughter, Mary Tudor the Younger, the future Mary I of England. Because at this point in history, Mary, while relieved not to have Anne Boleyn as her stepmother anymore, she's still defiant about the annulment of her parents' marriage, and she is supported by the Pole family and the Courtenays, and by extension the Carews as well. And this is setting up another conflict that's going to come along a bit later. Henry's Privy Council is trying everything to make Mary sign the declaration or the Act of Obedience that would declare her parents' marriage invalid and herself as a bastard, which she has been refusing to do for ages now. And Henry, who has shown that he's not above killing people closest to him, i.e. his wife, people are now thinking he might extend that bloodlust to his daughter. They've tried to send people to appease her beforehand, so they sent Richard Rich, no, not Richard Rich, I'm going to get Richard Rich and Thomas Wriothesley mixed up a lot. So they send Rafe Sadler and Risley, they're not successful, and then they send Norfolk, but Norfolk, they don't actually quote what he says, but there's the reference to his threat to beat Mary's head against the wall until it's as soft as a baked apple. And he tears apart a tapestry. Lady Shelton, she believes that Norfolk was bluffing about the whole thing because he wants to find a way to put a Howard on the throne. Now he's lost someone close to the Howard family who was on the throne. He wants to put another Howard on the throne. Foreshadowing. But if Mary gives in and she becomes an heir again, then he's further away from the throne. And displays of violence aren't working. So Thomas Cromwell speaks to Mary alone and offers her kindness. He offers her a horse from his stables, says you can have anything your heart desires when you come back to court, and just says you don't have to read it, you can repudiate it later. And while Mary does sign, her heart is broken by having to do it, and she cries into his arms, which is very sad, but God, it's so nice to have a subtle Mary after My Lady Jane. Ugh. Let's just not think about My Lady Jane. So then later on, while they're all sort of sitting around a table like celebrating that they finally managed to get Mary to sign and there's a little bit more peace in the realm now, Cromwell confesses to his inner circle. So that's Gregory, Rafe Sadler, I believe, Richard Rich, Richard Cromwell, Thomas Wriothesley. He basically tells them that when he went to go and see Catherine in the original series, she told him to look after Mary, and he kept his promise, something he never admitted until now. And another subplot is also the rise of, I don't say the rise of, but the introduction of the off-screen Cardinal Reginald Pole, who has written a pamphlet defaming Henry for his actions against the Catholic Church. And the Poles are very slow to repudiate the contents of the pamphlet. So that's basically the plot of episode 1 of The Mirror and the Light. I could say more, but it does sort of go into the casting and how the performances are. So we'll go into casting. So I made a list of the characters who were in the previous series and have come back for the regular series, and like who has changed in terms of casting. So Thomas Cromwell is still played by Mark Rylance from the previous one. I think you couldn't really get anyone else other than Mark Rylance to do it. And Henry VIII is still played by Damian Lewis, and there's definitely been a development of Henry's demeanour since the previous series, where beforehand he was just a lustful, not exactly a youth, but like a lustful man with the passions, but he was also very easily manipulated. Yeah, it's when he's calm that's when he's his scariest, because you don't know how he's going to react to certain things. And he believes his own ego, that he strides the world like a colossus. His coats are bigger, and you can see his codpiece sticking out. And then when he's sitting in the Privy Council chamber, while he is holding that walking stick out because he's got an injured leg, he looks bloomin' terrifying sitting on that chair above the Privy Council and saying, "I literally dare you to try and defend my daughter." The Earl of Surrey says, "Oh my god, I think he wants you to kill his daughter." And yes, he's become so terrifying that Cromwell now has to keep a written record of Henry's wins just to be able to predict them. Anne Boleyn was played by Claire Foy again, but it was just footage of the previous one. Jane Seymour is played by Kate Phillips again, as she was in the original, and I was very surprised about that, because I honestly thought they were going to recast her. But then again, she's not going to be in the entire series, so I suppose like bringing her back for 2 or 3 episodes is fine. And Jonathan Pryce comes back as Cardinal Wolsey. I've already talked about that. So Suffolk, Charles Brandon is still played by Richard Delane. Cranmer is played by Will Keane, and I always thought that was a weird casting decision in the original series, because I've seen his Dark Materials where he basically played a Stephen Gardner-esque character, but now he's playing Cranmer. I really think that Will Keane should have played Gardner, I'm just saying, because he would have been perfect for that role. Rafe Sadler is still played by Thomas Brodie Sangster, and my parents and I were watching Love Actually the night before, so I was just like, he has not aged! Anyway, Richard Cromwell, I think he's Thomas Cromwell's nephew, and then after his father died he took on the name Cromwell. I think Richard Cromwell is the direct ancestor of Oliver Cromwell. I could be wrong about that, you can correct me if you like, but maybe there's just that connection. And finally, Mary Tudor, another big surprise to me, is still played by Lilith Lesser. Any relation to Anton Lesser? Yes, in the original, Mary was only in like one scene in episode 3, and then she was gone. So it is quite a surprise that they managed to bring her back to play her in a more prominent role, because she's going to be there quite a few times for the rest of this series. Because they're always speculating on when Cromwell's going to take another wife and who it's going to be. It's like they think it's going to be Jane Seymour marries Henry, they think it's going to be her sister Bess marries Gregory, they think it's going to be Mary, but then Cromwell gets executed. For a while I didn't realise that was her until she actually took her gabled hood off and like shook out her red hair. And it's another red-haired Mary. And then she turned around and was like, that's a Lilith Lesser. Oh, I didn't know the actress's name, but it's like, that's still her. So yeah, let's talk about the recastings. Now there's some characters on this list that haven't actually shown up in the series yet, they will in subsequent episodes. The first recasting, I think you'll notice, is that of the Duke of Norfolk. In the original series he was played by Bernard Hill, R.I.P. I think it was quite a breakaway role because Bernard Hill is probably most famous as King Theoden, who was like a proud but noble, honourable king, whereas the Duke of Norfolk is portrayed as definitely a veteran of several wars, but loud and brash and rude and crass. I mean, you could tell Bernard Hill was having so much fun in this role, but sadly he didn't return. I really thought that he was going to return and it would be like his posthumous final role on screen, but I was wrong. And he's replaced with Timothy Spall, who is a good actor, it's just I would not have predicted that to be the replacement for Bernard Hill. He still carries the portrayal of Norfolk being brash and crass. I think he does carry a lot of the snootiness belonging to the Duke of Norfolk. Timothy Spall, he does this thing with his face where he's very good at looking snooty. I am interested to see how he's going to go forward, because they're going to use him for taking down the Pilgrimage of Grace, and then he's going to be there for the arrest of Cromwell. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he's got to bring us. Now Stephen Gardner is not in the show yet. I think he will show up in a future episode. In the original he was played by Mark Gatiss, and now he's played by Alex Jennings. So I can't really comment on the recasting. I'm guessing either Mark Gatiss was unavailable or he was also too expensive, like Tom Holland. I'm interested to see what he will bring to the role of Gardner. I mean, Simon Russell Beale's Gardner was also quite terrifying. It's a very good role to play when you just want to play like a Frollo-esque character. Now, Richard Rich was played by Brian Dick in the original. He's now played by Tom Mothersdale. And then Thomas Wriothesley, or Call Me Risley, was played by Joel McCormack in the original, and he's now replaced by Harry Melling, and I recognised that recast instantly. Like, the second he came in, I was just like, oh, it's him! I did the same thing in his Dark Materials when he showed up for that one episode with Lin-Manuel Miranda, and I'm like, I know you! And then he got mauled by Yorick Bernison, and I was like, eh. And yes, Gregory Cromwell, who is Thomas's surviving child, is played by Charlie Rowe instead of Tom Holland. It wasn't until I was sitting down and we started playing and it was the repeat of the last scenes of the final episode that I realised, hang on, have they brought Tom Holland back? I accidentally said Tom Hollander, and I was like, no wait, Tom Holland. I'm not the only one to make that mistake, as Tom Hollander's bank account will tell you. But then I thought, wait, they could not have brought Tom Holland back for this. There's no way the BBC could afford him for like a 6-episode series anymore. And I was right, they had to recast him. I mean, I was very surprised in, again, his Dark Materials when they managed to be able to afford James McAvoy, Lin-Manuel Miranda and Andrew Scott, all for a single episode. No wonder that episode was so dark, they couldn't afford to light anything. Oh yes, this is a very ironic recast. In the original series, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was played by Janet Henfrey, but now she's recast by Dame Harriet Walter. And if you have watched the Gregory-verse, Harriet Walter played Margaret Beaufort in The Spanish Princess. It's quite baffling. It's like Mark Rylance playing Thomas Boleyn and then playing Thomas Cromwell and then sharing a scene with Thomas Boleyn, because in the first series of The Spanish Princess, most of Margaret Pole's character arc is being screwed over by Margaret Beaufort, and now she's taken on that role. It's like, mind blown. I'm confused. What's going on? Lady Rochford, who hasn't appeared yet, was played by Jessica Raine, who also played Catherine Parr, and that was a very confusing role because she looked exactly the same and acted exactly the same, but ignore that. She's now being played by Lydia Leonard. It's a good thing I waited on that Jane Rochford video, because now we have another Jane Rochford to talk about. In the third book, she does come in and out, like, after Jane Seymour dies, like, leaning into Cromwell going, when are we getting another queen? When are we getting another queen? When are we getting another queen? And then there's, like, a hint of her connection to Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard will appear. Edward Seymour is played by Will Tudor instead of Ian Batchelor, and Chapuis has been replaced from Matteo Almarek to Karim Kadja, and for some reason he has more of a French accent than a Spanish one. I tried to look for a Thomas Seymour credit, I couldn't find Thomas Seymour. I'm supposing he got cut. It wouldn't be that big a deal if he was. Also, Margaret Douglas is in the cast, as well as Thomas Howard the Younger. So I think they're also going to feed into Margaret Douglas, which is good for Margaret Douglas because she's only got one other on-screen credit, and that's in Reign. So it's about time Margaret Douglas was given some attention. So there are going to be 6 episodes of this new Wolf Hall series, Mirror in the Light, and it's following the exact same timeline as season 3 of The Tudors. So I think I can predict what's going to happen, what's going to be featured. They'll have 2 fewer episodes than season 3 of The Tudors, but most of the focus is going to be on Thomas Cromwell, so they're still going to cover a lot of history, but not be bogged down in subplots of other characters. I couldn't find the titles of the upcoming episodes, but I'm assuming they're going to be related to the chapter titles. So the next one will probably be The 5 Wounds, because it might be about the rising up of the Pilgrimage of Grace. And then episode 3 probably be called Broken on the Body, because that is in reference to the death of Jane Seymour. Episode 4 is likely going to be the fallout of Jane Seymour's death, Henry in mourning, wondering if the king's going to marry again, and the fall of the Courtenays and the Poles. So that will probably be called Corpus Christi. And then episode 5, I believe, will have the introduction of Anna von Claver, which will be called either Twelfth Night or Magnificence. And then episode 6 will be Cromwell's downfall. I'm really looking forward to seeing how they're going to cover his downfall, because, it's been so long since we saw one. Not since 2009, not since Tudors season 3. I mean, that did show a very good coverage of Cromwell's downfall, because this was a downfall 3 seasons in the making. But it does feel a bit rushed. I highly doubt they're going to show Thomas crying his eyes out on the scaffold as they did at the end of season 3. I was like, dude, stop crying, have some dignity. I also wonder if they're going to have the guy who was executed with him, or if they're going to show him being hacked to death. Oh, there's so many possibilities. But yeah, it is literally covering the same time period as Tudor season 3, so I'm gonna be unable to ignore how Tudors covered it versus how Wolf Hall plans to cover it. So far, it is a very interesting new series, although the pacing is really slow. So if you're watching it on your own, it's fine, but if you're watching it with other people, if they're not as switched on as you are, then they might get bored. I mean, I have to be switched on because I have to pay attention to every bloody detail, because eventually I'm going to have to make a video about the entire series, so... Sorry, I had to stretch it there. I can't think if there's anything else I need to say. I think the one thing that was in the Tudors and won't be in the Mirror and the Light will be the execution of Margaret Pole, because that didn't happen until 1541. In the Tudors they did feature the fall of the Poles, but that was probably because they just wanted to show Henry's further descent and determination to extinguish any threats to his throne. It was a bit of a wasted plotline, the Reginald Pole thing, because he didn't come back at all in the 4th season. But anyway, that was Wolf Hall Mirror and the Light episode 1 Wreckage. If I predicted the titles of the future episodes, that's awesome. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see like how these recastings go forward, the performances of these characters. Like, I'm mostly looking forward to like Henry and Norfolk, and to another extent also Mary. I don't know why, but I'm just morbidly fascinated by portrayals of Mary I, because I really like the ones that actually try to give her depth, like in Elizabeth R, Six Wives of Henry VIII, and then followed by the Tudors and becoming Elizabeth, and this. Because Mary was not a two-dimensional person, she was not black and white. She was not always determined to burn all the Protestants. She was not born a monster. Everyone loves a villain origin story. I think that's all I've got to say for now. It's 22:11 and I'm not dressed yet, so I better get on that. I just want to give a quick thanks to my patrons who support the channel so wonderfully. If you want to be a supporter of this channel, you can sign right up. The link is in the description. You can get benefits from being a member, such as getting your name in the credits right here. And to my top tier contributors, my King and Queen patrons, thank you, Anna from Gustine, Annalise Barnett, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. And if you want to hear the rest of my thoughts about Wolf Hall, which will come out in January, make sure that you subscribe and like this video so I know that you want to hear me talk about Wolf Hall some more, and the algorithm will know, and then more people will come to the channel.
Let's just hope she's rubbing noses with Jesus.
Is this turnout weak or what? Had at least 70 more people at my funeral. Heather? God, Veronica. My afterlife is so boring. If I have to sing Kumbaya one more time...
What are you doing here?
I made your favorite. Spaghetti. Lots of oregano.